This is Chapter 4, Dr. Topman Plays a Visit. The building of the spaceship down in the cave took exactly 3 days. Now this may seem like a very short time to the average person, but it was almost beyond belief how some strange power took hold of the hands of the two boys, so that their fingers, all of themselves, seemed positively to fly from one thing to the next. Not once did Chuck and David have to stop and ask themselves how the building of the spaceship should go. Every now and then, bigger boys from over on the next block would go down by the far end of the beach. Then Chuck and David would watch to see if they intended to come near, and if they were ready, if they did, to trick them away. But those bigger fellows seemed to have business of their own. Nobody came near. Captain Tom seemed, for those 3 days at least, to be totally uninterested in taking the boys fishing. Nor did he inquire as to what exactly was being done with his wood, with his boat ribs, and with those odds and ends of sheet metal which he had said they could have. It was a funny thing about Captain Tom. When they'd gone to ask him for the wood and the pieces of metal sheeting, he had been splicing rope. He did this very carefully and deliberately, and with such neatness that you could hardly tell where one piece of rope left off and another began. He was a nice plump man with snapping blue eyes, pink cheeks which were red-veined from all the storms he'd been in, and thick, crisp, curling white hair. Sometimes when you asked him a question he didn't answer right away, and so it seemed as if he hadn't heard you, but he never missed a thing. Now, when the boys had made their request, they waited with beating hearts, for they expected all kinds of awkward questions. But Captain Tom squinted at his rope in silence. Then at last, just as if he were giving them permission to use his nails or a hammer, he'd said slowly, not looking up at them, "Well, now, seems to me I can't think of a thing I need those old boat ribs for, or those pieces of aluminum sheeting. No, sir, not a thing." Then he'd slid each of them a kind of quick, sharp, sparkling look out of the corners of his eye and smiled to himself. And the boys had stared at each other across the comfortable roundness of his stomach, thanked him breathlessly, and then stolen quickly away. Quickly, before he could change his mind or ask why they wanted the ribs and the sheeting. But he never asked, and their private affairs and what they were up to seemed not to be on his mind at all. Only Mrs. Topman was worried. "David," she would call after him in exasperation at noontime, "you haven't eaten half your—" But he would already be gone. There was nothing she could do. "The boy's possessed," she would cry to Dr. Topman when he came home in the evening. "He'll get over it," Dr. Topman replied, but he looked grave. He had a thin, kind face with sparse hair on top, and whenever he looked grave, he looked very, very grave indeed. His patients always said that they would have trusted him to take off their heads if he needed, to look inside, pop them back on again. "By George, I do hope the whole thing isn't a joke," he said. "It isn't," replied Mrs. Topman, and she didn't know how she knew this, but she did. "I keep meaning to hunt up Thallow Street," said Dr. Topman on the last morning. "Then somehow I forget. But there's no person by the name of Bass in the telephone book, and no Thallow Street on any map. I tell you, my dear, there is no such place. I think on my way home tonight I shall have a good look for it." So he did. And the same evening at dinner, Dr. Topman was strangely quiet. He'd chew for a while, then he'd stare at the tablecloth with the oddest expression on his face. "Is anything wrong, dear?" inquired Mrs. Topman anxiously. "No," said Dr. Topman hastily. Nothing at all." "What are you thinking about, Father?" asked David. "Thinking," said Dr. Topman in surprise, just as though he'd never done such a thing in his life. "I'm not thinking, I'm just eating. And you would do well, young man, to follow my example. Stop asking questions." "Okay," said David, "but I have something to tell you, Father. We finished the spaceship." For some reason, Dr. Topman's face grew red. "Did you now, David?" he exclaimed heartily. "Well, that's fine," he coughed. "That reminds me," he said. "I happened to go by this Thallow Street on my way home to look up your friend what's-his-name." David stopped chewing and looked at his father with his mouth half open. Then he swallowed. "You mean," he said in a low voice, "that you've seen Mr. Bass? You mean he's real, then?" "Real," replied Dr. Topman briskly and matter-of-factly. "Of course he's real. Why wouldn't he be? Anyone would think that there's something peculiar about all this." Why would there be? There was a notice in the paper, wasn't there? Someone had put the notice in the paper, didn't he? Well, he did. Nothing strange about that. And this Thallow Street is a little short street only about 6 blocks over from here. Can't think why I've never seen it. You go up to the end of it, and there's number 5, perfectly plain and ordinary. I couldn't find anyone about, so I walked through the garden and round the house, and then came right out again." David's eyes were like saucers. "You did, Father?" he breathed. What happened?" "Why, nothing happened. What should happen? It's a nice little house with a garden, that's all." "That's all?" wailed David. "But what was it like, Father? Did you even see Mr. Bass?" "In a manner of speaking, yes. I thought I'd just take a peek in the window as I couldn't rouse any more, and would you believe it, the window was flung right up in my face and a head appeared. I was absolutely startled out of my wits. I must admit I've never been in such an embarrassing position in my life. Oh, Father, persisted David in an anxious desperation. Was it Mr. Bass? What did you say to him? Very little. I was rather in a hurry. Now kindly get on with your dinner. And that's chapter 4.